everyone stay put. We are now on to the second session here. As a reminder, we will not have a Q&A session after Senator Mitchell has his conversation with Ambassador Lader. It is an honor and a pleasure to welcome Cynthia Baker to the podium to do the next introduction. Cynthia is a longtime member of the College of the Atlantic Summer Institute Planning Committee and will be stepping into the role of chair of our Board of Trustees. Thank you and welcome, Cynthia.
Thank you, Sylvia. And thank you, Patrick and Daniel, for the fascinating conversation. We'll move now from saying nothing to saying a lot about the troubles and the process for peace. I'm here this evening to introduce a pathbreaker who really needs no introduction, especially in this place. With his accomplishments, after all, George J. Mitchell is first a son of Maine, raised in Waterville, a graduate of Bowdoin College, and a tireless Maine public servant. In this age when states' people seem in short supply, we look to beacons like George Mitchell. To my good fortune, I got to see his example firsthand. As a new college grad with Bangor roots, I was hired to work for Senator Mitchell in Washington, doing the glamorous work of answering phones, operating the Capitol building elevator, and drafting letters to very testy constituents. But really, I got a seat to a master class in statesmanship. Senator Mitchell reigned over the Senate hallways, spearheading consequential policy, often crossing the aisle for consensus. He was held in the highest regard by a chamber that agreed on pretty much nothing else. His intelligence and fairness resulted in his selection as Senate Majority Leader in 1989, a position he held for 6 years. His deft leadership gave us landmark legislation, including the Clean Air Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the Family and Medical Leave Act. George Mitchell stepped down from the Senate at the height of his influence in 1995 after representing Maine for 15 years in Washington. And perhaps he wished then to retire happily to Seal Harbor and perfect his tennis game. But of course that wasn't to be, which brings us to this evening's topic. In 1996, President Clinton and the British and Irish governments asked Senator Mitchell to lead the peace negotiations in Northern Ireland, an urgent effort to end decades of violence in what was, as we've heard earlier, seemingly an intractable conflict. Around tables in Belfast and Dublin and London, he brought together deeply divided communities and moved opposing parties beyond zero-sum positions. His persistent, deliberative diplomacy culminated in the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, a landmark accord that became a model for conflict resolution around the world. Britain's Tony Blair said, "George Mitchell has the patience of a saint and the skills of a surgeon." Ireland's Bertie Ahern said, "Without George Mitchell, there would have been no peace process." President Clinton called him one of the greatest peacemakers of our time, and history agrees. Certainly there's much more to highlight: a federal judge, a Middle East peace envoy for President Obama, lead steroid investigator for Major League Baseball, Walt Disney Company board chairman, Presidential Medal of Freedom recipient. But let's move on to hear from the man himself. Following the senator's talk, he'll be joined by Ambassador Phil Lader for a conversation. Phil served as US Ambassador to the United Kingdom during the period of the Northern Ireland peace process, and himself played an important role at a critical moment in the negotiation. Please join me now in a warmest College of the Atlantic welcome for Senator George Mitchell.
Thank you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your warm reception. President Sylvia Torti, Cynthia Baker, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to once again be part of this outstanding program each summer at the College of the Atlantic. I want to say to Cynthia, I was deeply moved by your introduction, and it reminded me of a story about introductions. After the Good Friday Agreement was reached, I returned to my home in Seal Harbor, and I wrote a book about my experience in Northern Ireland. It was published the next year, and the publisher arranged a book tour around the country to promote sales. In the process, we received many, many invitations from Irish American organizations. And I learned the interesting fact that in the United States, there are more Irish American organizations than there are Irish Americans. And everyone wanted me to come. I couldn't go to all, but I did to many, and there developed among them a competition as to who could lay it on the thickest. They were long, rambling, frequently inaccurate. One guy in Chicago read off a long list of things, and it was obvious he'd gotten the wrong page in someone's biography because I was not familiar with most of what he said. Of course, the proper reaction would have been for me to exercise some humility, to ask them please to keep it short, but I had an improper reaction. I loved it. I encouraged them. I scolded them when they left something out. And so by the time I got to the very last event on the book tour, en route back to Mount Desert Island, at the Irish American Society in Greenwich, Connecticut, I had a hard time squeezing my head in the front door. But when I got in, the first person I met was an elderly woman who rushed up to me very nervous and excited. She had a big poster in her hand. She said, I'm so glad to meet you. She said, I drove all the way across Connecticut just to come here to shake your hand, to tell you how great I think you've done, and ask you, please, would you autograph my poster? And so she handed me a big cardboard poster and a pen. I looked at it. I said, I'd be very happy to autograph your poster, but before I do, I think there's something I should tell you. She said, what is it? I said, I'm not Henry Kissinger. It was a big poster of Kissinger. She said, you're not? Well, who are you anyway? And when I told her, she said, well, that's just terrible. She said, I drove all the way across Connecticut to meet a great man named Kissinger, and all I've got is a nobody like you. I said, I'm sorry you feel so bad. I wish there's something I could do. She thought for a moment. She leaned forward, and I leaned forward. We were in sort of a conspiratorial crouch. And she said in a low voice, would you mind signing Henry Kissinger's name to my poster? So I did. And as far as I know, it's still hanging in her living room in Connecticut, a daily reminder of me not to take too seriously these wonderful introductions that I've gotten. Well, I appreciated the prior panel. I thought it was truly outstanding and informative, and I congratulate both Patrick and Daniel, and I ask you to join me again in a round of applause for them for their terrific work. I was asked to speak today about my experience in Northern Ireland. When I retired from the Senate, President Clinton asked me to serve as his representative in Northern Ireland. He said it would be part-time for 6 months. it turned out to be 6 years, during which I chaired 3 separate but related sets of negotiations. The principal discussions which produced the agreement involved the governments of Ireland and the United Kingdom and 10 Northern Ireland political parties. It was a long, very difficult, and deeply contentious process. Although there were nominal ceasefires, they were routinely broken by repeated bombings and murders. Over and over again, I had to suspend the talks in the heated aftermath of a new tragedy. But unplanned and out of desperation to keep the talks going, I began to meet with the parties separately, often in their offices, and there I mostly asked questions and listened. It was tedious and repetitious. And I remind you, this went on for years, not days, weeks, or months. But in the end, it helped me greatly. People who like to talk enjoy being with people who are willing to listen. And if you listen carefully enough, you will eventually learn something. And after years of listening, by the time the talks came to an end, a process which I will shortly describe, I had gained truly valuable, very, very important insights into how far each party could go on each of the critical decision areas. One of the nicest things ever said about me was a later remark by one of the party leaders who had been a very active participant in the violence, in the conflict. He said, he listened us to agreement. Well, finally, the people of Northern Ireland and the political leaders, after several years of very difficult discussions, changed the course of their history. In April of 1998, the governments of Ireland, the United Kingdom, and 8 of the 10 political parties who remained in the talks reached what has come to be known as the Good Friday Agreement. The next month, in a free and open democratic referendum held in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland, the people overwhelmingly approved the agreement. 95% in the Republic and over 70% in Northern Ireland. They categorically rejected political violence as a way to resolve their differences. They established a democratic and peaceful process as their preferred form of governance. To fully appreciate what they accomplished, it's necessary to understand at least a little of what they had been through. In 1922, after a brief but very bloody uprising, the people of Ireland gained their independence after 800 years of British domination. In most of Ireland, there was a Catholic majority, but in the 6 counties of its northeast, there was a Protestant majority. After contentious dispute, those 6 counties became what is now known as Northern Ireland, a part of the United Kingdom, along with England, Scotland, and Wales. Over the following decades, Northern Ireland was racked by disagreement and escalating violent clashes between unionists, predominantly Protestant, and nationalists, predominantly Catholic. The unionists wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom. The nationalists wanted to be part of a united Ireland. Northern Ireland is not a large place in population or in land area. Less than 2 million people live in an area that is quite a bit smaller than just Aroostook County here in Maine. In the last great spasm of violence in the quarter century prior to the agreement, a period that has come to be known by historians as the Troubles, about 3,500 people were killed in sectarian violence, and about 50,000 were injured, many of them brutally and permanently maimed in ways that intentionally left them alive, but permanently incapacitated. This was not a war between armies on defined battlefields. It was a war of sudden, random bombing, murder, and maiming. Although it ostensibly began as a paramilitary conflict, it quickly descended into attacks on civilians. Sudden death could and did strike anyone, anywhere, anytime. And so fear hung over the whole society like a heavy and unyielding fog. The political leaders of Northern Ireland spent their entire lives in conflict. They knew nothing else. Some had been directly involved in the killing and maiming. As I earlier noted, after they began in June of 1996, the negotiations which I chaired were plagued for nearly 2 years by angry accusations, bitter insults, dramatic walkouts, and suspensions by the governments of several parties over acts of violence. I shouldn't have been surprised because I'd been warned. On the very first day of the talks, one of the party chairmen yelled to me across a crowded, noisy conference room. "Senator," he said, "if you are to be of any use to us, there is one thing you must understand above all else." "What is it?" I asked. With a broad smile, he said, "We in Northern Ireland would drive 100 miles out of our way to receive an insult." I laughed, thinking he was joking, but as I looked around the room, nobody else was laughing. They were all nodding in agreement. In early 1998, of nearly 2 years of this effort, we hit rock bottom. The murder of a particularly prominent paramilitary leader touched off an escalating round of retaliatory killings. Every morning, if a Protestant was killed, you knew that before sundown, a Catholic would be killed, and vice versa. The British and the Irish governments, in desperation, moved the talks from Northern Ireland to London in January of that year, and then to Dublin in February. But there still was no progress. To the contrary, 2 parties were suspended during the talks, from the talks, for being complicit in the violence, and tensions rose, as did the violence. And so reluctantly, I came to accept that the talks were doomed to failure unless there was a dramatic change to force a decision. So I drafted a detailed plan for a final 2 weeks of intense negotiations that would begin in late March and end on Easter weekend, a final and unbreakable deadline. The process would then be over, one way or the other. The governments and the 8 political parties still in the talks agreed, even though they still confronted very difficult issues on which they held strongly conflicting views. But the only alternative to an agreement was a return to devastating violence, almost certainly more widespread and destructive than ever before. In retrospect, it is clear to me that fear of that outcome was a very important factor in driving them to agreement. My memory of those last 2 weeks is a blur of intense activity, very little sleep, but for the first time in years, serious and meaningful negotiations. On the last week, the prime ministers of Ireland and of the United Kingdom came to Northern Ireland, and they participated personally and effectively in the negotiations. On the very last night, President Clinton stayed up all night at the White House on an open telephone line, participating long distance. By the morning of April 10th, Good Friday, we had assembled the product of all of these efforts into a single document that had the support of both governments. My colleagues and I met with the leaders of the 8 political parties that remained in the talks. We urged them to support the agreement, and we stressed the devastating alternative should they fail to do so. Some responded quickly and favorably. Some engaged in bitter internal debates that lasted through the entire day. But by that evening, they had all voted in favor, and the agreement was signed. It was a political compromise, the best that could be achieved at that time. It did not resolve all of the outstanding issues, but it did bring to an end, hopefully permanently, the political violence that had for so long devastated Northern Ireland. In the end, the credit should go to the people of Northern Ireland who supported, urged, and worked for an agreement, and to their political leaders who acted with courage, strength, and vision. Afterward, all were at some point criticized or rebuked. Some lost their political offices. Some of their political parties went into steep decline. On both sides, there were many who scorned the agreement as a sellout. But those leaders did what was right, and history will judge them favorably. It will take time and perspective to assess the full impact and meaning of the Northern Ireland experience, both there and elsewhere. If history teaches us anything, it is that history itself is never finished. Life is constant change for every human being, for every family, for every human institution and society. And in human affairs, the solution to every problem frequently, indeed most often, contains within it the seeds of a new problem. There are 8.5 billion people in the world. Each is unique, and all of us are flawed and fallible. Being keenly aware of my own limitations, I will keep my comments on the meaning and effect of the Northern Ireland peace process to this. Whatever similarities or differences exist between and among human conflicts, courageous political leadership is indispensable to ending those conflicts in any way other than total victory and defeat. Fortunately, that emerged at the critical moment in Northern Ireland. In sharp contrast, for example, there was violent conflict into which the former Yugoslavia dissolved. There, the national leader, Milosevic, fanned the flames of division, and tens of thousands of people died. At about the same time, Czechoslovakia was breaking apart. The national leader there, Václav Havel, acted with restraint, reassurance, and strong democratic leadership. As a result, not one person was killed as the Czech Republic and Slovakia were created as new countries. Of course, the situations were not identical, and unfortunately, there have not been many Havels in human history. But as we saw in Northern Ireland, great leaders can emerge to meet the moment. Another factor there was the direct, peaceful involvement of the United States. Before President Clinton took office, no American president, even those of Irish heritage, would get involved in any way in Northern Ireland. The conflict seemed intractable, and it involved, on opposite sides, two of our closest allies, the United Kingdom, our mother country, with which we have had a long special relationship, and Ireland, with which we have a deep bond of blood, with well over 30 million Americans of Irish heritage. But President Clinton became deeply and personally involved, first by encouraging and increasing investment in and trade with Northern Ireland to provide economic support for what was then the early stage of a renewed peace process, and then by providing direct support and participation in the three but related separate negotiations that led to the agreement. As a result, without providing a single weapon or dropping a single bomb, the United States played a crucial, significant role in the peace process in Northern Ireland. Now, it's important to acknowledge that there are many continuing disputes and divisions in Northern Ireland. A so-called peace wall still separates Catholics from Protestants in Belfast, the capital and largest city. The major political parties remain largely based on religious preference, as does education and housing. It will take a very long time for that to change, but it is changing. The important lesson is that while all human societies have difficulties and disputes and disagreements, they can and should be resolved through peaceful and democratic processes. In that respect, Northern Ireland stands as a powerful example of what is possible, even in a world deeply troubled by conflicts old and new. In their journey, the people of Northern Ireland deserve our continued friendship and support. My thanks for your attendance here today, to the College of the Atlantic for hosting this conference, and for inviting me to participate on it. Now, I will be joined here by Phil Lader, who has a home in Northeast Harbor, who during the latter stages of the negotiations which I described was the United States ambassador to the United Kingdom. And at a critical moment in the process, when it was falling apart, Phil convened meetings at the ambassador's residence in London, secret meetings to escape the very difficult conditions that the negotiations were occurring in Northern Ireland. And we met there for a week. We didn't finally solve the problems, but we had a very good start at creating a rapport between the two conflicting parties, so that upon our return to Northern Ireland, we were able to bring it to an end. Phil is a dear friend. I've known him for many years, and so I'd ask him now to join me on the stage. Ambassador Phil Lader.
What an honor for me and for all of us just to know this man. Wouldn't you agree? Well, let's put this conversation in a historical context.
You got to look at me, Phil. You got to look at me when I'm talking, because I can't hear anything anymore.
But I was saying something complimentary. I didn't want you to get your head too big. Okay? Let's put it in a historical context. It's spring 1994. George Mitchell is in his 6th year as Senate Majority Leader. Justice Harry Blackmun announces that he is planning to retire from the Supreme Court. And President Clinton calls George Mitchell and offers him the job. And Senator Mitchell says, I'm committed to serving out my term in the Senate because we're in the midst of this health care debate, which is critical, not just for the people of Maine, but for the entire United States. And he declined the opportunity for the lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court. President Clinton turned to Steve Breyer. About the same time, there was, as you've heard for the last hour and 20 minutes or so, a civil war that was raging in Northern Ireland, that had been raging, euphemistically called the Troubles, but had been raging for more than 30 years. But there was at that time a peace process, 13 parties, the 2 governments, of course, the United Kingdom of England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. I was there on behalf of the US, the Republic of Ireland. My counterpart, Ted Kennedy's sister, Jane Kennedy, if you remember. But in addition to that, you had these 10 parties, political parties in Northern Ireland. And there was an independent chairman. But the process was going nowhere. And so, on December 10th, George marries Heather. Most important event. Within a few weeks, January 2nd, he steps down from the Senate at the end of his term after 15 years, as Cynthia said, in the United States Senate. And a week later, he takes this offer to spend a pleasant 6 months in Northern Ireland. And as he often described it to me, the next 6 years was like going to the same opera every single night. But if you were to count up the number of days in which he was in active negotiation, and this is his words in retrospect, it was 700 days of failure and 1 day of success, April 10th, 1998. And so for all of us in this session this week talking about leadership, we wonder what really leads to success like that. George has often said, and he made reference to it, unyielding perseverance, commitment, yes. But also what he calls a certain kind of muscle, a patience muscle. A muscle for the word that has been repeated almost in every session this week when talking about leaders. Listening. The muscle to lead. The muscle to listen. And so my first question for George is this. Conversations we've had in the past, I know that MDI, Mount Desert Island, which you have called the most beautiful place on earth, not very good politics, but still what you really believe.
We're glad you joined us.
Yeah. That Mount Desert Island, as well as the US Senate, played a critical part in your building up this muscle of listening and patience. I think everybody would like to know why. Why did MDI and your experience here as a senator dealing with issues on Mount Desert Island help build up your patience muscle?
Thank you, Phil, for your kind words. I entered the Senate by appointment. Senator Muskie, my predecessor, for whom I had worked previously, was appointed Secretary of State by President Carter in May of 1980, after the resignation of the prior Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance. That created a vacancy in the Senate. And then Governor Joe Brennan appointed me to complete Senator Muskie's term. I have to deviate here to say that Senator Muskie was perhaps the greatest, or at least one of the greatest men I've ever met. He's absolutely brilliant. He had his faults, like we all do, but he was a truly great man. And what I learned about public service, I learned from him and from Joe Brennan. When Joe Brennan called me up, to my complete surprise, and asked me to come to meet with him at the governor's mansion in Augusta, that he wanted to appoint me to complete Senator Muskie's term, I was surprised. I went to Augusta, I met with him, and after telling me he intended to appoint me, he said, I have only 2 conditions. And I thought to myself, uh-oh, what's going to happen? He said, first one's from Senator Muskie. He wants you to keep his staff on. I said, absolutely no problem. He said, the second condition is from me. He said, I want you to make a personal commitment to me that every decision you make in the Senate, casting a vote or otherwise, you will promise to do so solely on the basis of what your conscience and your judgment tells you is best for the people of Maine and the people of this country. He said, I will never ask you to say or do anything. And he never once asked me to say or do anything. He simply encouraged me all the time. And Joe Brennan was a human being, like all human beings. We all have strengths and weaknesses. But between he and Senator Muskie, I felt that I had a very high standard to try to meet in the Senate. And I worked very, very hard for 15 years, including 6 as majority leader. Now, the first day I became a senator, I was appointed. I was, in no exaggeration, a nobody in Washington. I asked each of Senator Muskie's staff members to meet with me one-on-one so I could get to know them, because I promised to keep them on. And I asked each one of them, what do you do? What are you working on? What advice have you got to me? What would you do if you were now the senator? And one of them was a young woman from Lewiston. She's now has spent her career as a lawyer in Portland, Estelle Lavoie. And she went down a list of things she was working on. And one of them, she said, is the most difficult and interesting, but I think you should do it. There was, at the time, a long-standing dispute on Mount Desert Island and other surrounding towns between the Park Service and the communities. When the first charter for what has become Acadia National Park was submitted to President Wilson by the Rockefeller family, George Dorr, and others, it provided that the new, what has become now Acadia National Park, the new park, could not acquire land other than by donation. You couldn't take it from a willing seller. It had to be by complete donation. That led, over the next half century, to a fragmentation. There were little bits of the park in 11 different communities. And as you all know, when it becomes a park, it doesn't pay taxes, doesn't pay property taxes. There's a small fee in lieu of taxes, but it's not equal. So the towns became increasingly alarmed about their fiscal situations. As this thing grew, there was no central core. And so I came up here. It was in January. There were about this many people on the whole island, I think, then. To make it a very long story short, I've already gone on too long. For 6 years, I negotiated with the towns, Bar Harbor in the lead, but the other 10, and the Park Service, to establish a series of land swaps that would result in a relatively contiguous park. I was helped by the fact that we did it first in 1982, 2 years, on Isle Ho, which is smaller, not as many visitors, somewhat easier to deal with. We had a lot of very difficult issues. There were some hard feelings, but in the end, I was able to draft legislation. I had the support of all my colleagues in Congress, Senator Cohen and the others, and we enacted legislation which created the park in roughly its current circumstance. And so I much later said that I didn't realize that on all my visits up here, meeting with the towns and listening to all these arguments, that God was preparing me for Northern Ireland. But he was. And let me say, as a result of that experience, I've spent every summer of my life, but a couple of years when I was sick, here, and I have a home in Seal Harbor, so I feel very honored and privileged to be part of this community.
George, I want to ask a related question, not about the specifics of Northern Ireland, but I suspect many of us here, with our families, with close friends, who have different points of view, today have some difficulty maintaining those relationships, listening to people who have a different point of view.
I'm sorry, Phil.
And many people here have the situation where relatives and close friends have different points of view and have difficulty spending time together even.
Yeah.
As you know, I went month after month meeting with the leaders of Northern Ireland in my job, since Northern Ireland is part of the UK. And the most difficult thing for me to maintain my composure was knowing that some of the people with whom I was meeting, who were described in the first hour of this session, were people who had committed heinous acts of violence. Many had blood on their hands. And so I want to ask you, you had to tolerate in these negotiations on 700 days opinions, arguments, views of people you knew were complicit with violence. How did you maintain the ability to listen and to communicate and respect their views?
Well, the first point I would make is I was a politician, and as such I like to talk. When I became Senate Majority Leader, I slowly and gradually began to realize that the less I talked, the more effective I was. It was kind of a startling revelation, somewhat difficult to accept to myself. My persuasion in politics typically had been speaking to large crowds, doing interviews, but now I was dealing with 99 other individuals, almost all of them in one-on-one or small number conversations. And I knew that each one of them felt that they were better qualified than I to be majority leader, and that each one probably felt they ought to be president. And so I found it amazingly effective when I stopped beginning meetings by saying, here's what I'd like you to do, by asking, what would you like me to do? And more listening, getting a better sense of what they really felt. And so I mentioned earlier that God was preparing me my 6 years here, and he was preparing me further, or she, whichever, prepared me further for the 6 years I spent in the Senate, because I engaged in hundreds and hundreds of conversations, and the least successful were the ones when I talked the most and where I said things in anger that I should not have said, where I judged people. And even if the judgment was right, they had earned their seat, they had been elected, they represented millions of people, and they were entitled to have their views heard and listened to and pondered by myself as the majority leader. So when I get to Northern Ireland, yes, the party leader that I mentioned in my remarks about driving 100 miles out of the way, He had been convicted of attempted bombing and murder. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison. He served 6 years in prison. He came out a powerful advocate for peace. More than anyone, he understood what was at stake. And because each of them, in order to be eligible to participate in the talks, they had to be elected. These were not self-chosen persons. They tended to be mostly political figures, but not all. So they had achieved a status by virtue of being chosen by the people they represented, and it was not within my capacity or intention to deny them that, because I knew they had committed crimes before. And it's a very, very difficult part. You didn't ask this question, but I want to say something else about it. That's extremely difficult in Northern Ireland to this day. All prior efforts at negotiation in Northern Ireland failed because the governments would not permit into the talks any political party that was affiliated with a paramilitary that was doing the killing. They called those parties constitutional parties, no paramilitary affiliation. By the time the effort I chaired began, it became clear what ought to be obvious. If you're trying to end a war, it's very hard to do so without talking to the people who are fighting the war. It seems obvious in retrospect, but they had to go through a process of election to be there, and they deserved my respect to listen to what they had to say as a representative of their people and not be judged by it. Now, the agreement itself, the most difficult and controversial part of it, was a provision which provided a mechanism, a legal mechanism, for the early release of prisoners who had committed acts of murder or other atrocities. Didn't guarantee their release, but it created a mechanism for doing so within a 2-year period. That became the most controversial issue in the referendum process, because all of the families of the people who'd lost loved ones were strongly, understandably, bitterly opposed to this provision. The British and Irish governments called me up not long after I got back to New York and asked me to come back and meet with these families because they felt I had credibility and try to persuade them to support the agreement. I met with dozens and dozens of such families, and I explained to them, without this provision, there would not have been an agreement. The political parties that were affiliated with paramilitaries, on the nationalist side is one, the Sinn Féin and the IRA. On the unionist side, they have 2 or 3. They're dispersed, but they form a counterforce of the same. They would not have agreed to sign the agreement. So I said to the families, if we had not included this provision, there would, with 100% certainty, have been a renewal of violence, and many, many other families would become like yours, losing a family member. That was the reason for doing it. And I confess to you here, I did not convince one of those persons to change their vote. They were just hurt so deeply to lose a father, a mother, a son, through violence and brutality, was more than people could accept. But the argument was, I think, persuasive enough for the majority to support it. But to this day, 27 years later, there are people with wounds that have never healed, and they never will. And the society has to move on, understanding that there was horrific violence, There were horrific crimes. They can never be forgotten, but they cannot become a mechanism by which the conflict continues.
You can understand why, when George left the Senate, one of the principal pundits in Washington said that George Mitchell is the most respected, trusted man in the Capitol. That was in evidence, obviously, in the work in Northern Ireland. But George had a totally clear-eyed view about the Good Friday Agreement. And he said often that the agreement in and of itself was not sufficient to guarantee peace or to guarantee political stability.
That's right.
You kindly made reference to one situation when, over a better part of a week at our residence, two issues were dealt with.
Yeah.
The first issue, of course, was the
Yeah.
decommissioning of the paramilitary weapons. And then the second was, of course, the nature of the executive.
That's
But I want you to refer to another time when, frankly, the Good Friday Agreement was under siege. And that was the Omagh bombing.
Yes.
As you can well remember, President Clinton came the next day. You and I joined him in Omagh. It was time for grievance, grieving with the people, but the need for you to help rekindle the enthusiasm to support the agreement. What are your reflections of those days in Omagh?
Well, the agreement was reached in April of 1998, and the referendum was held a month later in May. And the referendum was overwhelmingly favorable. And I was back here on MDI. I can never forget the day, August 15th, a warm Saturday, in the town of Omagh, O-M-A-G-H, a small town in western part of Northern Ireland. A horrific bombing had occurred. Highly complicated, I won't get into details, but 30 people were killed and well over 300 were very seriously injured. The process hung by a thread. President Clinton called me late that night and said that he was going to Omagh. Would I go with him? And Prime Minister Blair went. And we met in a community building with several hundred people who were survivors. Emotions were extremely raw. Almost everyone there had lost a family member or someone had been seriously injured. And we sought to, by meeting with them individually, they asked, I don't know who arranged this, the President went to that part of the room, Prime Minister Blair went to that part of the room, and I went to that part of the room, and we met individually with maybe 100 people each, one at a time, telling us their stories, and we pledged together. But more important than what we did, by then the government had been set up, and the mechanism that the government has is that what we would call a prime minister, they call it first minister, comes from one side, the party with the largest vote, and then the deputy, they call it deputy prime minister, first and second prime minister, comes from the other side. And the first two were a man named David Trimble, a very prominent unionist leader, who later received the Nobel Prize along with John Hume, a Catholic, and the deputy was a Catholic political leader named Seamus Mallon. And I say this, they're both gone, they're both tremendous people, they didn't like each other, but they became the first and the deputy prime minister, and they were in Omagh within hours, arm in arm, determined not to go back to what went on before. And the incredible thing is, as awful as that bombing was, and the stories are horrifying, it actually united the people of Northern Ireland. They did not want to go back. Now, a year later, in July the following year, they didn't get along, they couldn't get along, they had constant bickering, failings. The process fell apart completely. It was July 16th, 1999. And the prime ministers and the president called me and asked me where to go back. I went back, and I was there 6 months, and we were able to put it back together again. What we Americans would call jerry-rigging, with Scotch tape and string. We put it back together again. But so you always have these two competing currents. You had those committed to violence who regarded anything less than 100% of what they wanted as a sellout. And they're a minority, but given the presence and power of weaponry in our society, two people can go into a hardware store and buy something that'll kill hundreds. And so then you have the majority that doesn't give up their beliefs or commitments, continues in disagreement, but wants it resolved through peaceful, democratic ways. And I believe with all my heart and soul that it's going to prevail in Northern Ireland. And I don't know that for sure. It's been 27 years. They're still arguing over many of the same things, but the violence has ended. And there's a tiny faction on both sides. And you know how it is in modern society. Those who shout the loudest and make the most extreme statements get the press attention. So you might read the papers and think that they're large in numbers, but they're not.
One question of serious intent, and then a lighter question, if I may. The serious question is, after this job, an awfully tough assignment, another president asks him to go to the Middle East. The success you had in Northern Ireland has not yet been realized in any fashion in that region.
Yeah.
What, in your opinion, and we have to be brief at this late hour, is the difference in the circumstances that allowed peace to be achieved in Northern Ireland, in which we continue to fail in the Middle East today?
Yeah, I'm going to answer that in a minute, but I didn't really I got off on a tangent, which I frequently do these days. I didn't answer your question about when we came down to see you. No. When I went back in 1999, they were fussing and feuding, and the press was wild with speculation about a return to violence. So the two leaders at that time, the two parties, were Sinn Féin, headed by Gerry Adams, and the Ulster Union is headed by David Trimble. They didn't get along at all. But they came to see me together. And they said, look, we can't make any progress here. The press is too violent, too strong. You know, ladies and gentlemen, there's a huge tension in all democratic societies between the right of the public to know what's going on and the importance of having at least some occasions and some subjects that can be discussed in private. If you did everything in politics and government in full view of the public, 90% of legislation wouldn't pass because people feel the need to put on a performance for their constituents instead of trying to solve the problem. So they wanted me, the two leaders said, we can't do it here in Northern Ireland. We want you, Senator Mitchell, to find a place in America where we can go and have complete privacy, and then we'll settle this thing quickly. So I said, I'll try. I went to the British and Irish governments. I spoke to the prime ministers, and they were both very skeptical. They said, look, these guys all like free vacations in America. I said, you can do it, but you find a place either in the UK or in Ireland. Well, we don't have to go on an expensive trip. They were already footing the bill for all this stuff. So Trimble came to me the same very day, and he said, look, I just read in a London newspaper that the US ambassador's residence in London has just completed a 2-year renovation. It's a magnificent structure. It was owned by a member of the Duke family in the United States, a very wealthy family, and she donated it to the US government when she, I don't know whether, when she passed away or earlier. And so, and he was the ambassador. So the two, I then called him up and I said, Phil, is it okay if we come and I'll stay with you and we'll have all our meetings with you, and these guys will stay in hotels under assumed identities in the area. And of course he said, okay. And we came and spent the week. Now that's when That's when the famous story about the operas occurred. I said to them, 2 rules. We're going to all have lunch and dinner together. No more just all on one side and all the, everybody's going to be mixed up, and you can't talk about the details at the meal. So they all said, well, what are we going to talk about? I said, what do you talk about in your real life? Your kids, your vacation, what your wife's doing, where your, how your job is going. What do human beings talk about when they not spend all their time fighting like you guys? So they agreed, and we had a jovial dinner the first night. And then Trimble was sitting to my right, and a guy yells across the room, David, I understand you like the opera. Is that true? And when's the last time you went to an opera? And Trimble said, yeah, I like the opera. He said, I couldn't go, but I listened to one last night, and they described the opera. And then another guy yells across to me, Senator Mitchell, do you go to the opera? I said, well, yes, I do. I said, in fact, every time before I come here to meet with you guys, I make it a point to go to the opera the night before. And they all kind of said, why? I said, look, I want to get in the right frame of mind. When I go to the opera, I know in advance every single word that's going to be spoken or sung. I've seen La Boheme 10 times, and Rodolfo never ever says anything different. I said, and that puts me in a good frame of mind to meet with you guys. And they got a big kick out of it.
George, we're going to have to leave to another time the discussion of the Middle East. We'll leave the Middle East discussion to another time. But I do want to ask you one question in brief, and that is this.
Move the mic.
How can we as a divided nation today in many ways, how can we as citizens best contribute to what we are praying is occurring in Northern Ireland thanks to your leadership?
Yeah.
The bridging of divisions, the healing of wounds, the forgetting of animosities.
Yeah.
What can we as citizens today do to have that occur in our country?
Well, I don't know, Phil, that I have an answer beyond what what others more expert in the field of public opinion. But in my view, I have 2 comments which are seemingly contradictory, but which I think do finally coalesce. The first is that had there been social media of the type that now exists, an enormous technological advance, I doubt we could have gotten an agreement in Northern Ireland. I really doubt it. It's just too difficult when you're confronted with this night and day, and some wise man once said, a lie is halfway around the world before the truth gets out of bed. And the ability to convey and distribute and disseminate all kinds of blatantly false accusations and things, I think would have overwhelmed us at the time of the talks, and I really, frankly, doubt we would have gotten it. On the other side, we are Americans. We have a long and very proud history. And yet, our history is filled with setbacks, enormous difficulties, blatant falsehoods, seemingly intractable issues. I'm just now reading one of the great authors of our time is a guy named Rick Atkinson. He's the author now of a 3-volume history of the American Revolution. It's fantastic to read the difficulties that they encountered. Just think about it. Slavery existed in America for 250 years. 250 years. We count as a nation our beginning at 1607 with the landing at Jamestown, Virginia. People came before that, of course, especially Spanish and French. But that's what we consider the beginning. Just 12 years later, 1619, the first slave ship landed in Virginia. So for 250 years, we had slavery, and then, after it was abolished in the most brutal, savage war in our history, another 100 years of legally created, state-sponsored segregation. If you say, we've got a lot of tough issues now, are there any tougher issues than that we face now? And we still haven't overcome it, but we've come a very, very long way. Martin Luther King said that the arc of justice bends toward peace, I think he said. I can't remember the exact words. He should have added very slowly. And it is slow. But we've overcome many, many more other hugely challenging and difficult issues. Let me tell you another story that I don't think any people are familiar with. When the Second World War broke out and the British people were in desperate straits, the invasion by the Nazi Germany of Poland in September of 1939, France in May of 1940, and the air war over England. It seemed completely hopeless. But there was very, very strong political sentiment in the United States against getting involved in the war. Very strong political sentiment. Franklin Roosevelt was at that time the first president in American history to be running for a third term. And he was acutely conscious of the difficulties of public opinion. He came up with a scheme to avoid the neutrality laws that are on the book called Lend-Lease, where we would ostensibly lend ships to the British, and somehow later on they would pay us back. It was a scheme to get around it because he was afraid of public opinion if he got into the war. And sentiment in favor of Germany was very strong in this country. When the vote went to the Congress in the House of Representatives to support the Lend-Lease scheme, it passed 203 to 202 by one vote. Within 18 months, Japan had attacked at Pearl Harbor, Hitler had declared war on the United States, and opinion in the United States made a complete 180-degree reversal. So the 203 members of Congress who voted for Lend-Lease spent the rest of their lives claiming to have cast the decisive vote in the defense of democracy. And they were right. Without Lend-Lease, you can argue, no one can ever know, that Britain might have fallen without other forms of aid we gave them. So we've been through a lot. Tough times, difficult times. But the one thing, and great leaders have made great mistakes. Franklin Roosevelt refused to let a shipload of Jews coming to this country. We didn't know the full terms of the Holocaust, but we knew what was happening, and he refused to let them land in the United States. And Cuba refused to let them land in Cuba. And they went back home, and half of them died in the Holocaust. Franklin Roosevelt signed the order that permitted the internment of hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans on no basis other than their ancestry. We later apologized. He is one of the greatest presidents we ever had, but he made serious mistakes, like every human being does. We are all, what did Patrick say? I say we all suffer from the weakness and the possibility of failure, but we've always come back. We've always come back as a nation, bigger, better, stronger, more fair.
George?
Let me finish. I'm on a roll here. Now think about this. It took 125 years after the creation of the United States of America for women to have the right to vote. 125 years it took on something that now seems to us to be so obvious. You say, how could anybody have rationally opposed it? But even the most intellectual and great people of the times opposed it. So look, I'm going to be 92 next month. I can hardly wobble off the stage. I'm not going to see much more. But I have complete confidence. I really have 100% certainty that my kids are going to enjoy a better, freer, more open country than the one that has existed in my lifetime.
Sylvia, I must close with one question to the audience. Will you agree with me that amongst our neighbors, amongst political leaders who are our contemporaries, there is no individual who better exemplifies wisdom, courage, patience, integrity, and authentic service than this 91-year-old Senator George Mitchell.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Mitchell and Ambassador Lader. I echo very strongly Phil's comments on the senator. It's always a pleasure to hear him speak and to hear a true statesman who's thought deeply around a lot of the issues that he has experienced over his lifetime. We began our conversation this morning around pathbreakers in the political sphere, learning about Charles Sumner, which was absolutely fascinating. We're here thinking about Ireland and the Troubles, and tomorrow we will land in Russia, where we'll have a session titled Alexei Navalny, the Patriot, with David Remnick and Craig Kennedy. David Remnick will be joining us via Zoom, and Craig Kennedy will be here with us in person. And now I know you're all anxious to make your way to the Geyer Oval. See you tomorrow.